She was sold to a brothel at 16, until a mysterious outlaw changed her fate. The wagon wheels screeched to a halt in front of the Scarlet Raven brothel. Dust danced in the scorching sunlight, and inside the rattling cage sat a 16-year-old girl, wide-eyed, trembling. Her wrists were tied, her mouth dry as paper. From the shadows, the madam of the brothel stepped forward, a tall woman in blood-red silk, eyes sharp like a hawk. "Is this the one?" she asked coldly. The man beside the girl, her uncle by blood but not by heart, nodded. "Fresh from the mountains, strong hips, quiet." The madam tossed him a leather pouch that jingled with coins. Without looking back, he climbed onto the cart and rode away. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where we bring forgotten voices back to life through stories of resilience, redemption, and rebellion. Today's tale is more than just a narrative. It's a journey through fire, scars, and the silent strength of a girl who refused to be broken. If you're someone who believes in second chances, hidden truths, and the quiet power of survival, you're in the right place. But before we dive into the shadows and light of this chapter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to light, and every click is a vote for stories that matter. Her name was Clara, and that was the moment her old life ended. The brothel doors creaked shut behind her, sealing her fate. The hall smelled of perfume and pain. Women in bright rouge and dim eyes watched her silently. "Don't cry," one of them whispered. "It won't help." But Clara didn't cry. Not that night. Not even when they shaved her hair and rubbed her skin raw to bleach away the farm girl in her. She bit her tongue until she tasted iron. She was born in a small mining village on the edge of Arizona. Raised by her mother, a healer who was hanged when Clara was 10 for witchery. After her mother's death, Clara became property, passed from relative to relative, until the one who needed coins sold her like cattle. And yet, even in her silence, Clara refused to break. She listened, she watched, and every night, she carved a tiny mark on the underside of her wooden bedpost, one for each night she survived. The madam called her June, saying, "Clara sounds too dusty." And June became the girl who served tea to gamblers, refilled perfume bottles, scrubbed sheets. They said she'd be ready soon. And each day brought her closer to that curtain she dared not cross. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a stormless dusk, the kind where the air holds its breath. A commotion stirred outside, hooves pounding, windows rattling. Suddenly, the brothel doors burst open with a bang. A man stood there, silhouetted by the fading sun. Dust clung to his long black coat, a rifle slung across his back. His face was hidden beneath a hat pulled low. "Who the hell?" the madam began, but he raised a finger, silencing the room. "I'm looking for a girl," he said, his voice deep, scarred by the desert. "One you bought 6 months ago." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The madam laughed. "We have many girls. You'll need to be more specific. She's 16. Hair like fire, eyes like storm." He stepped forward. The air turned electric. "Her name's Clara." Everyone turned. Clara stood frozen. She didn't know this man, had never seen him before. But in his eyes, she saw something no one had offered her in a long time: fury and purpose. The madam narrowed her eyes. "No Clara here, just June. That's her," he said, "and I'm taking her." The room erupted. The bouncer lunged, but the man moved faster. A gunshot rang out. The chandelier above shattered, raining sparks. Girls screamed, ducked. Clara didn't move. In that chaos, he turned to her and said, calm as still water, "You coming or not?" For the first time in months, she spoke. "Who are you?" He tossed her a silver coin engraved with a strange symbol, a raven wrapped in flame. Someone who doesn't like cages. She didn't know why, but she believed him. Clara ran behind her. The madam shrieked, "She's mine!" But she didn't look back. They stole a horse, rode into the dark, wind tearing at their faces. He didn't speak much, just rode hard until the lights of the town were dots behind him as dawn broke. They stopped at the edge of the canyon. He handed her water, bread. She stared at him. "Why did you come for me?" He didn't meet her eyes. "Because someone once did the same for my sister. I owed a debt." But you don't know me. No. He said, but I know what they do to girls like you. She wanted to ask more, but the earth never stops turning. Suddenly, they heard hoofbeats again. More riders, dust rising in the distance. They're coming, he said, and they won't stop. She looked down at the coin in her palm. Then at the man who'd shattered her prison, and she made a decision she would fight for her own freedom. But who was he really, and why did he bear the mark of a man who was declared dead 10 years ago? The sun was barely awake when they reached the edge of Drybone Ridge. A forgotten trail known only to those who had something to hide. Clara rode behind the stranger, her arms tight around his waist, her mind a hurricane of questions. He still hadn't told her his name, and when she asked, he simply said, names carry weight. Right now, you need to stay light. Behind them, dust trailed like a snake. Someone was following. She could feel it in her bones. He finally spoke, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. They'll send bounty hunters, maybe even the sheriff, but not to bring you back. To make you disappear. Clara's heart pounded. Why? I'm just a girl. He smirked, bitter. You're not just anything. You were bought by the madam. You think she lets things go? The man guided the horse off the main road and into a thicket. We'll rest an hour, then ride west. As she chewed on dry jerky and stared into the wind, Clara dared to ask, did you really have a sister? He looked at her then, and for a second, she saw something crack behind his calm pain. I did, he said. Her name was Leela, sold at 15. I was too young, too scared to stop it. 10 years later, I tracked the man who took her. Found him dead, but never found her. Clara didn't speak. What could she say to that? He added, softer this time. That coin I gave you. It was hers. Before she could answer, a sharp whistle sliced through the air. The man's eyes widened. Up, he barked. They've found us. Gunshots echoed through the trees. Horses screamed. Clara ran, ducking low, her feet pounding like thunder. The man fired back, quick and clean. One rider fell, another cursed in Spanish and charged. Clara found herself cornered by a third man, tall, with rotting teeth and eyes like a hyena. He grinned. The madam wants you back, girl. Before he could grab her, the outlaw leapt between them, slamming the rider to the ground and knocking him out cold. Blood sprayed onto the leaves. I told you, he growled, dragging Clara by the wrist as they ran. They won't stop. They reached the riverbank, where he whistled sharply. A hidden rope bridge dropped from above. Clara hesitated. It swayed like thread in the wind. He didn't wait. He crossed. Fast and fearless. Clara, he shouted, move. And so she did. Halfway across, a shot hit the rope. The bridge snapped. She screamed as she dangled, fingers gripping frayed hemp, her feet swinging over the chasm. He dove, grabbing her hand. Don't let go, she sobbed. I can't. Yes, you can, he said. You're stronger than what they did to you. With a final heave, he pulled her up. She collapsed into his chest, breathless, trembling. Why are you doing this? She whispered. You don't even know me. He met her eyes. Because I used to be you. Later that night, by a quiet fire, Clara turned the coin over in her palm. She remembered the hyena-eyed man's words. The madam wants you back. Not alive, not safe, just back. That meant something deeper. Who is she really? Clara asked. The man poured coffee into a tin cup. Before she ran a brothel, she ran guns. Before that, slaves. She answers to someone bigger. You weren't just sold, Clara. You were delivered. Clara stared into the flames, her jaw tightening. Then I'll make them regret it. The man raised an eyebrow. That's a dangerous promise. She stood, taller than before. I don't care. I want my name back. The next day, as they crossed into the burned-out town of Greystone, they found a girl about Clara's age begging near the well. When Clara offered her bread, the girl pulled a knife. I don't take pity. But before she could strike, Clara caught her wrist and twisted gently. I'm not here to hurt you. I just know what hunger feels like. The girl blinked, surprised. You one of the madams too? Clara hesitated. I was. Not anymore. The girl said nothing, then turned and ran. Clara watched her disappear into the shadows. There are more like me, she whispered. The outlaw nodded. Hundreds, maybe thousands. That night, as they slept in an abandoned chapel, Clara found a journal tucked beneath the altar. Pages torn, words smeared, but one entry stood out. Red raven coin equals mark of blood. Those who carry it either hunted or chosen. She sat frozen. Leela, the man murmured beside her. She carried one too. Clara looked at him. And now I do. Why? He looked at her for a long moment. Because you were meant for something else. And they know it. Before she could speak again, the sound of boots on broken glass echoed behind them. The madam had arrived herself, flanked by 5 armed men, eyes glowing in the candlelight. You thought you could steal from me, she hissed. That girl is mine. Clara stood, no longer trembling. I belong to no one. The madam smiled coldly. Then you'll die alone. The outlaw reached for his gun, but too late. One of the guards shot first. The bullet hit his shoulder. He crumpled. Groaning, Clara screamed, grabbed the gun from his belt, aimed, fired but missed. Now she was surrounded. The madam stepped closer. You're no killer, girl. Clara's hand shook until the sound of distant howls pierced the night. Dogs. Wolves. No voices. From the hills, shapes emerged. Women. Girls. Dozens of them. Each one marked by pain. Each one holding something sharp. The girl from the well was among them. She raised her hand. Now, she whispered. Clara blinked, then understood she wasn't alone anymore, and this time, the hunted were ready to hunt. The gunshot shattered the silence inside the chapel. And in a flash of smoke and fear, Clara saw the outlaw fall to the ground, blood spilling across the dust-covered floor. Time slowed. The madam laughed, raising her pistol again, but before she could fire, Clara screamed, not out of fear, but rage, and lunged forward, knocking the weapon from the madam's hand. They fell together, grappling, kicking, teeth bared like wolves in a death struggle. Around them, chaos broke loose. The girls who had once been victims now rose like a tide, one smashing a chair across a guard's back, another lighting the curtains on fire, smoke curling up toward the wooden beams. In the heart of it, Clara fought like someone who had already died once and come back burning. The madam pulled a blade from her sleeve, slicing across Clara's arm, but Clara didn't flinch. She grabbed the old woman's wrist and slammed her head into the floor. You stole my name, Clara hissed. Now I take it back. Suddenly, a second gunshot rang out, not from the madam, but from one of her guards. Clara turned, too late to stop the bullet, but it didn't hit her. The outlaw, wounded but alive, had thrown himself in front of her again. This time, the bullet pierced his side. He collapsed with a grunt, blood pouring from the wound. No, Clara screamed, running to him. He looked up, his breath shallow. Finish it, he whispered. Don't let them win. Clara's hands trembled as she turned, facing the last of the madam's men. One raised a gun, but dropped it when the chapel doors burst open. From the smoke emerged a figure wrapped in a ceremonial cloak of the Lakota tribe. Antlers hanging from his belt, war paint streaked across his face. Behind him came 20 warriors, silent and sharp-eyed, carrying bows, knives, and the weight of justice. We heard the cries of stolen daughters, the chief said, his voice like rolling thunder. And we have come, the madam screamed, backing away, but the girls formed a circle around her. The chief handed Clara a small leather pouch. Inside was a silver pendant, a sun etched with 3 arrows. The mark of a bloodline nearly wiped out. Clara stared at it, stunned. This belonged to your mother, the chief said. She was one of us. You carry her fire. The world tilted. Memories flooded in. Her mother's lullabies, the scent of sage, the hush of drumbeats. Then it's time I light that fire, Clara whispered. Outside, as dawn broke over the hills, the final confrontation unfolded. The remaining guards fled or surrendered. The madam, bound and bleeding, was dragged before the people she'd wronged. What do you want to do with her? One girl asked. Clara looked down at the woman who had sold bodies like cattle and smiled without warmth. Let her live. Let her rot in the same silence she forced on us. The warriors took her away, not as a prisoner, but as a relic of a world that was dying. The outlaw, barely conscious, lay beneath the great willow tree behind the chapel. Clara knelt beside him, pressing her hand to his wound. "Stay with me," she begged. He opened one eye and smiled faintly. "Didn't come this far to die in the dirt." "You're not," she said. "You're going to live long enough to see this place burn clean." He chuckled. "Always knew you were trouble," as the fire consumed the brothel, turning its red silk walls to ash. Clara and the girls stood hand in hand, the wind whipping through their hair. For the first time, no one flinched at the sound of footsteps behind them. No one cowered when a man shouted. They were free, not just from the madam, but from the silence. One by one, the girls shared their real names. Ruth, Isabel, Faye, names taken from them, now reclaimed. When it came Clara's turn, she held up the pendant. "My mother called me a Hyoka," she said. "It means she brought happiness." And they believed her. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, a wedding was held under the wide blue sky, where cultures clashed not with blood, but with songs. Clara wore a dress woven from deerhide and silk, half Lakota, half frontier. The outlaw, his real name now revealed as Eli, stood beside her. The silver coin once meant to curse now resting on a string around his neck as a reminder. Their vows were simple, no promises of forever, just a vow to never run again as the sun set over the prairie. Clara stood atop a hill, watching the wind carry the ashes of the brothel into the horizon. A small boy ran up beside her, one of the girl's younger brothers, orphaned by the war on innocence. He held her hand and asked, "Will the bad people ever come back?" She squeezed his fingers gently. "Maybe," she said, "but next time, they'll find we're not afraid." Behind her, music played, drums and violins, war cries and lullabies, a harmony born from pain and promise. And then, just as the final stars blinked awake, Clara saw it, a shooting star blazing across the heavens. A sign, maybe, or just light finally outrunning the darkness. Either way, she smiled because in this wild land where law once meant silence, a new story had been written. One where the girl who was sold had become the woman who led. The wind whispered through the canyons of the south as if carrying stories too ancient for words. And in one of those winds, a raven flew low, its feathers black as spilled ink, circling above the burned ruins of the Scarlet Raven brothel. But beneath those ruins, half buried in ash and stone, something gleamed, a silver dagger shaped like a serpent wrapped around a bone, its blade etched with symbols long forgotten. A hand reached down, picked it up, a gloved hand, a new figure, a shadow, a man who had been watching from far away. "So the girl lives," he said quietly, "and she remembers." Meanwhile, far from there, in the border town of Las Cruces, Clara stood before a weathered grave, placing a bundle of wildflowers beside the name, Ahyoka, daughter, healer, flame. Beside her stood a small group of survivors, girls who now wore clothes of their choosing, boys who had stopped flinching at raised voices, and Eli, leaning on a cane, his smile crooked but alive. Clara knelt, touched the soil. "You were right, Mama. Our names are our fire." As they left the graveyard, a boy ran up, breathless, holding a folded letter sealed with red wax. "It came for you," he said. Clara opened it. Inside were 2 words scrawled in sharp ink. "He remembers." Her eyes narrowed. "Who?" she whispered, and the boy shrugged. "It came from the east." Eli took the note, studied the ink. "That's a war brand, from the old Confederacy. He's not just some outlaw. He's one of the architects." That night, as stars poured across the sky like spilled salt, Clara sat by the fire and opened a weathered book, her mother's journal, hidden in a saddlebag since the day she escaped. Inside, among recipes and remedies, were maps, notes, sketches of ancient symbols, and a warning written in Lakota: "The coin is not payment. It's a key." Eli leaned over her shoulder. "Key to what?" She traced the line of the raven and the serpent. "Something buried, something they'll kill to protect." He said nothing, but his eyes burned with purpose. Meanwhile, in the northern mountains, a different story unfolded. A woman wrapped in silk with jagged scars across her back looked into a mirror. She had once been a girl locked in the brothel's east wing, hidden from the others. trained not for comfort, but for politics. She now held a ledger in her hands, one Clara had missed. Inside it were names, buyers, prices, towns, and one name circled in crimson, Ahyoka. She closed the book and whispered, "Sister." Elsewhere, in the Lakota Highlands, Chief Two Arrows carved the old stories onto bark, passing knowledge to his grandson. "The girl who walks with thunder," he said, "is not done." The boy asked, "Why did the spirits send her back?" The chief answered, "Because the land needs a voice, and the old gods have gone quiet." In a dusty saloon on the edge of the Mexican border, an old bartender cleaned a glass and muttered, "The coin's back in play." A bounty hunter beside him looked up. Then the game begins again, and beneath the earth, in a forgotten mining shaft turned temple, robed men gathered around a fire shaped like an eye. One spoke, "She carries the mark." Another hissed, "We failed to kill the mother. We won't fail the daughter." Back in Las Cruces, Clara sat beneath the stars with Eli, the silver pendant around her neck reflecting the firelight. "What if we don't find the truth?" she asked. He looked at her, his hand brushing hers. "Then we make a new one." Suddenly, from the shadows, a figure stepped into the light, a young man barely older than Clara, dressed in a Confederate officer's coat, the serpent dagger at his belt. He didn't raise a weapon. He only said, "They're coming, and you need to see what they've buried." Clara stood, her jaw set, eyes steady, "Then start digging." The fire had long since died, but its warmth lingered in the stones. And Clara, now called Ahyoka by those who knew her story, sat beneath a willow tree with a child in her lap, the night breeze stirring strands of her hair as she whispered, "Once, there was a girl who thought she was nothing." The boy looked up at her with eyes full of stars. "What happened to her?" Clara smiled gently, looking out across the valley where the sun would soon rise. She learned her scars were not curses. They were maps. Her voice was calm, steady, but behind it echoed the thousands of steps that had carried her from a cage to a chapel to the edge of the world. In her other hand, she held the silver coin, now dulled by time and soot, and she turned it slowly, the raven's wings still sharp beneath her fingers. "This," she said, lifting the coin, "this used to be a chain. Now it's a compass." Not far away, Ruth, the girl with the braids, sat outside her small tailor shop, stitching a wedding veil made of lace and leather. She hummed an old tune her mother used to sing before the raids came. And though the notes trembled, they held. Isabel, once mute from the brothel's cruelty, now stood on a small wooden platform teaching young girls how to read. Her voice clear, her presence unwavering, and Faye, the youngest, ran messages across the desert on a Mustang she named Thunder, carrying words like hope and names like flame to girls still hidden in the shadows at the edge of town. Eli sat sharpening a knife not for war, but for ceremony. His limp was permanent now, but so was the glint in his eye. He turned when Clara approached, her shadow stretching beside his. "They say the architect's riders have reached the Black Salt Range," he said. Clara nodded, her eyes not afraid, only focused. "Let them come. This time, we choose the ground." She stared into the horizon, and for a moment, time folded inward, her mind drifting back to the day her mother was taken. To the silence of the brothel. To the first time someone said her real name like it mattered. And in that swirl of memory, she saw herself, not the warrior, not the bride, but the barefoot girl pressing flowers between pages and dreaming of places where no one owned your breath. That girl was still here, but now she stood on a different ground in the mountains to the north. An old woman placed a red stone in a bowl of ash and whispered a blessing. "For the girl who broke the chain," she said, "may her fire light the way for others." And deep below, where serpents once whispered secrets into the ears of kings, a hooded man dipped his finger in blood and drew a symbol across the wall, a coin split in two. Back in Las Cruces, the night thick with smoke from cook fires and cedar, Clara climbed the watchtower and looked east. The pendant around her neck, her mother's sun and arrow, glowed faintly in the moonlight. She touched it and whispered, "You gave me roots, I'll give them wings." And in the final seconds of that stillness, A shooting star arced across the sky, just like the one she saw the night they burned the brothel to the ground. But this time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the earth was writing a new story, one where silence was not safety, one where names were not chains, one where a girl sold at 16 became the voice of a rising fire. The desert was blooming. After years of drought, a single cactus standing near the old chapel had burst into bloom, its red flower glowing under the morning sun like a drop of blood forgiven. Clara stood beside it, her boots sinking slightly into the earth as if the ground finally accepted her return. She held in her hands a folded deed, the ink still fresh, proof that she now owned the land where her silence was once sold. Behind her, the girls laughed as they built a new home, not with fear but with firelight, sweat, and stories. The outlaw Eli, healed in body but broken in sleep, walked slowly toward her, handing her a hammer. "Time to lay your first stone," he said. Clara didn't speak. She knelt and pressed her palm into the earth before placing the cornerstone. "For every girl who thought she wouldn't make it," she whispered, "this is where we begin." That night, under lanterns made of buffalo horn and old wine bottles, the people gathered for the harvest feast. Cherokee dances wove into Lakota drums. And the sky became a roof for unity. Ruth wore her wedding dress, half stitched by survivors, half by dreamers. Isabel read a poem about freedom, and Faye stood tall as a messenger to distant territories where other girls were still waiting. As for Clara, she didn't speak until the fire died low and the stars came out bold. Then, standing beneath the same sky where she had once begged for a sign, she said, "We don't get to choose the day we're born or the fire we fall into. But we choose what rises from the ashes." Eli stood beside her. The coin now melted into the hilt of a ceremonial knife they would use to bless crops. Not kill, they were not married in law, but something older than law bound them. A vow spoken not with rings, but with scars. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we head to the Black Salt Range." Clara nodded. "Let the architects come. Let them dig up the past. We've turned our pain into a map. And we've buried something stronger than fear. Memory." In the distance, an elder placed a rifle across the lap of a boy no older than 12, a child once lost in the brothel's walls, now reborn as a son of the village. "This isn't a weapon," the elder said. "It's a story. You carry it so no one forgets." At dawn, Clara rode out alone toward the East Ridge, where the light touched the land first. She reached into her satchel and placed a bundle wrapped in leather beneath a tree, her mother's journal, the silver coin mold, and a letter addressed to the next girl who escapes. Then she carved 3 words into the bark, "Tell her everything," as she mounted her horse. The wind picked up, and in it, a whisper, a language older than blood, older than chains. It said, "The soil remembers," and just before the screen fades to black, the final image lingers, the silver pendant, sun and 3 arrows, now resting in a glass case inside a small schoolhouse museum. Below it, a plaque reads, "Ahyoka, first light of the New West. Thank you for watching and staying until the final ember faded." If this story moved you, made you reflect, or reminded you of your own inner fire, please let us know in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your voice keeps this light burning. From all of us at Cracks of Light, we're grateful you're here. Until next time, keep seeking the light in every crack.